evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've got Mr. Sam Raghaveen here, a person who comes with a very distinguished background in the Australian intelligence services, a China watcher, and he's presently with the Lowy Institute, folks who are reputed for watching China very closely. I don't know how accurately, but very, very closely indeed. And I think we all gathered here today to hear him on China's military modernization. Three things stand out when we discuss military modernization, and that is the intention, the ambition, and the capabilities of a country which is in the process of modernization. I think China has moved very rapidly in modernizing its armed forces. It's something which has caused a lot of discomfiture to its neighbors, and its assertiveness has heightened these concerns. So anyway, let's hear Mr. Sam Raghaveen and the Australian perspective.
Thank you very much.
On this.
Now, should I stand up here? I think I'll stand for the, yeah. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the Ananta Centre for hosting the event today. And I'd also like to thank the Australian High Commission for bringing me to India. This is my first ever visit to India, only my third day in the country, having gone to Chennai first and then Mumbai yesterday. My head's still spinning a little bit. My background, as you heard, is with in the Australian intelligence community in Canberra. I've worked in defence intelligence in the Department of Foreign Affairs, also in the Office of National Assessments as a senior analyst, our peak analysis agency in Australia, and I'm now with Australia's, I think, foremost foreign policy think tank, the Lowy Institute, and my day job is to be the editor of the Institute's digital magazine, The Interpreter, which I encourage you all to take a look at, lowinterpreter.org. I hope you'll take a look if you haven't already. As I said, my first visit to India, I'm grateful now that this visit has coincided with the World Cup, because it's a terrific icebreaker everywhere you go here in India. And I realise now that we are probably set for, if things go the way the form suggests, for an Australia-India semi-final. So I'm glad I got here before that. That could have been a little untidy, a little bit ugly. But as I was saying to some people earlier, in a sense, Australia's already lost the World Cup, because it's a golden rule in Australian sport that whatever else happens, we must always beat New Zealand. And we didn't beat New Zealand, so in a sense the tournament's already over for us. I'm going to speak today, as you heard, about China's military modernisation, but I'm going to be quite specific and talk about particularly the aircraft carrier program, because it happens to be something I've followed reasonably closely, both when I was in government, working in the intelligence community, and now at the Lowy Institute. I also think it's a very useful lens through which to try to interpret broader trends in Chinese military modernisation. And I think the way to begin is just to say a little bit about China's strategic ambitions overall. And I think I'm just going to make a very blunt assertion here, which is that I think over the medium to long term, China's ambition is essentially to erode US maritime strategic primacy in the Asia Pacific. So to erode that primacy, and maybe even in the long term to overturn it altogether, so that China itself attains that status of being of having strategic primacy in the Asia Pacific region. So the main, I think, lens through which experts have viewed China's maritime modernisation in particular is this idea called anti-access and area denial, A2AD. This is a very common term in the literature, and it basically argues that China's strategy is not so much to develop an ocean-going navy that can maintain control of the oceans, much like the United States Navy now can, but in effect its ambition is more modest, that it simply wants to have the capability to to essentially undermine America's ability to have that sea control. Okay? Now, that kind of strategy suggests an emphasis on certain kinds of force structure. And in particular, it suggests a very heavy emphasis on anti-ship capabilities. So, for instance, we've seen the China developing anti-ship ballistic missiles, which is an entirely new class of weapon that nobody's ever developed before. We've seen a vast range of different, more conventional style of anti-ship missiles mounted on aircraft, on surface ships, and of course on submarines. So the emphasis for a so-called A2AD strategy is very much on the ability to deny an adversary the use of the oceans. And it is indeed true that many aspects of China's maritime force structure can be explained through that lens. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't really explain the carrier program. And it doesn't explain the broader emphasis that we've seen in recent years on ocean-going surface ships. So we've seen a pretty rapid and impressive expansion of destroyers in the Chinese Navy with very new anti-aircraft capabilities, the Type 52 destroyers, and more recently the Type 52D, which is a Chinese equivalent to the Burke class ships, or the Congo class in the Japanese Navy. And even more recently now, we're seeing the development of what is effectively a cruiser, the Type 55. We're yet to see that one. There are indications that construction has begun, but we know from other open sources that the Type 55 is definitely in development and will be a very large, a large surface ship, something, a type of unit that's not really consistent with an area denial strategy, but much more consistent with an ocean-going sea control strategy. So then, how do we explain that? If this is not consistent with the anti-access strategy, then how do we explain it? It's worth here just pausing to say a little bit about the aircraft carrier, specifically the Liaoning, and in particular its prehistory. I would point you to a series of articles that appeared last month in the South China Morning Post, which basically revealed for the first time how this ship came to be inducted into the Chinese Navy, and specifically how the Chinese Navy purchased the hull from the Ukrainians at the time. It was a half, well, I think 3/4 completed hull that was built for the Soviet Navy, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, it fell into the hands of the Ukrainians, where the shipyard was. And I found the most revealing and frankly quite startling detail in this series from the South China Morning Post was in the fact that the purchase of this hull from the Ukrainians came through the initiative of a single individual Chinese businessman. He was approached, crucially, by some officers, unnamed officers in the PLA Navy, and he was basically encouraged on his own to approach the Ukrainians and privately buy this vessel, which was then later towed back to China and over many, many years was refurbished into the condition that we see now, into an operational aircraft carrier. So to me, what's really revealing about this is the fact that the original decision, a major force structure decision really for the PLA Navy, and symbolically hugely significant, that this was not a decision that was taken by the PLA Navy. It was not a decision made by the Central Military Commission. It was not a decision made by the Politburo Standing Committee, or really by any formal government agency. It was an approach made individually by a group of officers in the PLA Navy to an entrepreneur, a private entrepreneur. Now, I know in my country and in your country we've had our problems with procurement over the years, but I think you would agree that that is a pretty unique way to procure a major fleet unit for your Navy, and says something really about the way decisions are made in China in regard to defence strategy. So that's something of an aside. Let me return to this question now of why China, given that it is supposed to be devoting itself to a more modest anti-access area denial strategy, why China would invest in this major fleet unit, which seems inconsistent with such a strategy, and also why it would make public claims, in fact, that it's going to build 3, possibly 4 more of its own carriers. And the evidence suggests now that construction has begun on the first domestic carrier. So it seems to me there are several reasons, several explanations, possible explanations for why the Chinese might be undertaking this major sort of force-structure decision. One is prestige. We know that the acquisition and the operation of these major warships carries with it, a sense of prestige, a sense that only countries with impressive high national power and impressive national capabilities can do this. And in fact, even though building aircraft carriers is a very difficult and expensive enterprise, in a national sense, this is a relatively easy and inexpensive way for China to get a boost in its national prestige. And I say that because the competition is not particularly huge around the world. So, for instance, even now, with one aircraft carrier that's not even operational yet, China is already in a class of its own in the Asia-Pacific. There is no other country in the Asia-Pacific with the kind of capability that China already has. The second point here is that carrier capability is actually in decline in most other parts of the world. The UK used to have a carrier fleet. It now has no real aircraft carrier capability at all. It's building 2 fairly impressive-looking Queen Elizabeth-class ships, but they are not in service for a number of years. And even when they reach service, the Brits may struggle to fund the air wing for those ships. The French, of course, are down from, for several years now, from 2 carrier fleet to 1. The United States has gone over several decades since the end of the Cold War down to an 11 carrier fleet. It'll probably, if I have my memories right, it'll probably go down to 10 within the next decade. In fact, the only country that's slightly bucking this trend at the moment is India. But of course, that is going to depend on the success of the domestic building program for the carrier fleet. And I know that's got problems of its own and that I don't need to tell any of you about. So this is a fairly easy way, in a sense, for China to build that capability of prestige. The second reason why China might be going down this path is for what are loosely referred to as out-of-area operations. Not wartime operations necessarily, but long deployments for peacekeeping, for instance, the anti-piracy operations that the Chinese Navy is involved in the Gulf of Aden. A carrier could also be a fairly handy asset for use in emergency response situations to natural disasters, for evacuating nationals. The Chinese, for the first time, when the Libya crisis came to a head several years ago, sent a lot of military and civil state assets to Libya to evacuate its nationals. That's going to be a growing there's going to be a growing demand for those kind of capabilities. An aircraft carrier could be useful in those sort of circumstances. The third reason why China might be investing in this capability is, this is a slightly unusual point, I think, but it has to be considered. It could be a mistake. It could be that this doesn't actually fit in any coherent strategic narrative. It is simply that there are institutional forces at play. There are certain, strong forces within Chinese bureaucracy that simply want this, and that even though it doesn't fit into a coherent strategic picture, that certain political bureaucratic forces have won out and have decided to pursue this course. Again, I don't need to tell you, as Indians, that sometimes procurement takes these kind of paths, that that political considerations win out over military strategic considerations. It happens in my country as well. The fourth reason that I want to dwell on, that returns us to the beginning returns us to where I started, is that this the development of aircraft carrier capability in China is actually part of a coherent strategic narrative, but it's simply not the one that we think is dominating Chinese thinking about maritime strategy. So rather than pursuing purely an area denial capability, China actually has something else in the works here. Now, I began with an assertion that China's ambition in the medium to long term is to undermine American strategic primacy in the Asia-Pacific. I don't think that China is pursuing that ambition by trying to match the power of the United States Navy one for one. I find it very hard to imagine in the next several decades, that China would try to develop a kind of military capability and a naval capability specifically that could match and overwhelm the United States. I don't think that's a realistic ambition for China. However, a more realistic ambition is that you develop a more modest carrier capability, perhaps 3 or 4 carrier battle groups, that can be very influential in regional scenarios. A capability that could easily overwhelm the modest military forces of countries that are involved, for instance, in the South China Sea dispute or the East China Sea dispute. And the counter-argument here is that, well, that's all very well. China may be able to build such a capability to be able to intimidate and, if necessary, overwhelm those countries. But many of those countries are allies or at least friends of the United States. So what happens then if the United States gets involved? And my response to that would be that China is already exhibiting the kind of behaviour that is, in the South China Sea in particular, that is trying to test the limits of American commitment to its friends and allies. And the problem here is that even though the United States has overwhelmingly greater military capabilities in this region, it may not have the same level of will and the same level of interests in these disputes as China does. So a dispute in the South China Sea, for instance, that involves what to the United States looks like just some small rocks, carries a great deal more significance, symbolic and also economic and strategic, for a country like China. So there is an imbalance here. America has a great deal more capability, but China has far more at stake in all of these conflicts. So I think where an aircraft carrier capability could be useful is in a scenario where there is tension between China and some of the other claimants to these territories in, say, the South China Sea or even the East China Sea. And in a situation where the United States has to make the difficult choice, do we intervene here? And at that point, the capabilities of the Chinese Navy, a strong surface capability, I think, make the judgment about thresholds for the US much more difficult. It heightens the possible cost to the United States of intervening, and it makes it much more difficult for these regional countries to actually to balance on their own against Chinese capabilities. So I think I'll leave it there, and I think I've probably gone over time already. Again, I want to thank you for your attention. I'm really pleased that so many of you have turned out, and I'm really honoured by it, and I'm interested to hear all your questions. Thank you.
Well, you've got a full house here.
Yes.
So obviously something's working for you. It was very interesting what you said, but that sort of gets me to ask you a couple of questions too. The first is when you spoke about China pushing the envelope, as it were, and its immediate ambition being to establish dominance in the Asia-Pacific or in the South China Sea region, which I agree with, incidentally. There was a survey recently, which mentioned, very recently in fact, which said that the Chinese, 80% of the Chinese who were polled, feel that the PLA is competent to, as they say, recover the Senkakus. And 74% feel that they can deter the US from intervening. So obviously the hype that is being created inside China is sort of matches the so-called maritime effort that they're putting in. I don't see them resiling, but what they have succeeded in doing, and this is where I would welcome your comments, is they seem to have dented US credibility in the region. When I talk to people in the, analysts from these countries, they sort of question why the US adopted such a hands-off policy when China pushed the Philippines around, and including with Japan. So is it that you think they're already gaining ground, or is it a kind of situation where the US is allowing them to push the envelope a bit more before it pushes back? And the second is about these islands that China is building in the South China Sea. Google recently had a whole lot of maps.
Yes.
So what do you think about that? There are a few more things, we'll come to that later.
Do I need this, or? No.
Yeah, I think we both.
Yeah. On the question of denting US credibility, yeah, I think that's already happened. I think that's already happened. For instance, first of all, I should say it probably hasn't happened to the degree that the Chinese people may believe. If that figure you quoted of 80%, I think those 80% are vastly overconfident at the moment. We're talking about capabilities that China is still building, but it's a long way from where I think it needs to be to really make its capability much more credible. Having said that, even with Chinese military modernization having reached the stage that it's at now, which is still very vastly incomplete, I think we're already at the point where, for instance, any US security guarantee to Taiwan is no longer credible. I don't think it's any longer possible to believe that in the very unlikely event that China was to launch a military invasion of Taiwan, that the United States would intervene on Taiwan's side, because the cost would simply be too high. Chinese capabilities have now reached a point where that sort of conflict would incur massive costs, military and strategic costs for the United States, including the loss of possibly several carrier battle groups, which have enormous symbolic value. And again, what I'd reinforce the point that I made at the end there. There's an imbalance between what this means for both sides. For China, this is a core strategic interest. For the United States, even looking at a Taiwan scenario, how do you justify to the American public possibly losing a couple of carrier battle groups and some bases in Okinawa and other places around the Asia Pacific to defend some rocks in the South China Sea? How does an American president justify that? That doesn't seem credible to me. The one caveat I would make on that judgment, though, is that this is the country that invaded Iraq, right? So the Americans are unpredictable. They do some crazy things from time to time. So, and in fact, in this scenario, that's in the United States' favour. It makes Chinese judgments about American intentions much more difficult. On the second point, islands in the South China Sea. Look, I think this is consistent with the idea that many analysts have expressed about the so-called salami tactics, where you gradually try to move the status quo in your favour. The one other point I'd make about this is that I think a lot of analysts take comfort from the fact that China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, including building up the islands, but also the gas platform off the coast of Vietnam, for instance, in the East China Sea, the air defence identification zone, other moves of that nature. A lot of analysts take comfort in the fact that these actions have led to reactions from countries in the region who are in turn moving closer to the United States and taking more steps of their own to improve some of their capabilities. For instance, with building up their coast guards or building up their air forces. Now, to a degree, that's true, and it ought to give the Chinese a little bit of pause. The problem is, though, that I think China can't help but see that this is happening, and yet it doesn't seem to care very much. That's a really worrying sign. If China doesn't care that, that there's this reaction to its assertiveness in the region, then I think, even though lately we've seen something of a pause in China's assertiveness, then I think we're in, for a long-term arm wrestle.
Yeah, I agree with you, but let me give you an alternate scenario to what you mentioned about a Chinese businessman being the first to approach Ukraine to buy the hull for the ship. I read that story.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't I didn't pay as much attention to it as I find you have.
Right.
In the sense that I've been reading a lot about in Chinese media and in statements of Chinese officials of their desire to have an aircraft carrier, of their desire to move out into the Indian Ocean. And this I talk about way back, so
yes,
before they had the economic wealth or the capability to fabricate these themselves. But the fact that they sent a person to Ukraine, or they did the initial soundings through an individual, could be because they wanted to conceal the fact that the PLA Navy was interested, rather than say that there was no decision at a higher level.
Yes.
Because I think the decision was there, and it's there even now to build a second and a third, and some people say up to 6. I don't know about that, but at least up to 3. What do you think about that? Do you think that's an acceptable alternate?
Yeah, I think so, and I'm glad you mentioned it because the South China Morning Post story is based on a long interview with the businessman himself. Now, I don't think the secondary sourcing on that story was particularly strong, so I'm glad you mentioned that because we do need to be cautious about those kind of reports. Having said that, a colleague of mine at the Lowy Institute, Linda Jakobsen, who's a very distinguished China scholar, used to work for the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Stockholm, SIPRI, and has been based in China for a very long time. She recently wrote a paper for the Lowy Institute about China's maritime actors. And her basic conclusion was that she saw no evidence of a grand strategy in China's maritime behaviour that would lead to very close coordination among the various agencies that are involved in its maritime policing, not just the Navy, but the various Coast Guards. Her conclusion was that President Xi Jinping would issue, at best, vaguely formulated guidelines, and that these would be interpreted in their own ways by various agencies which have their own institutional and bureaucratic interests, and would often interpret these vague guidelines in the most hardline way possible. And that has led to some of the confrontationalism you see. And the reason why I think I was probably attracted to the story in the South China Morning Post is that I think it actually says something very similar that about Chinese decision-making. It fits that formula of vaguely formulated guidelines at the top, but of various agencies, including the PLA Navy, putting their own spin on that and making their own decisions about things like procurement and force structure.
True. Yeah. And yet we do come across reports, fairly credible reports about the modernization that is planned, where they're going to merge the military regions, 3 of them with a maritime orientation, outward orientation, the rest for land. And we also have reports of the fleet, I mean, the maritime police as well as the PLA Navy vessels operating in South China Sea, receiving instructions from the Central Military Commission and not from their local formations. That seems to suggest, in fact, that there is some high-level group which is monitoring this.
Yes. The evidence is murky and contrary. I agree. I can only agree and just point to how difficult it is to ever know for certain in what is a relatively opaque system. And in fact, one of the reasons I focus so much on looking at particular weapon systems like this carrier is that in the absence of much openness in the Chinese system, we are left with looking for clues in the details of these ships and of these weapon systems to try to get a sense of Chinese strategy. We have to work backwards.
Before we monopolize, I think we'll open up for question and answers if you're willing. Yeah. So we have about 15 minutes or so. Please identify yourselves, keep it brief. Well, you obviously provoked a lot of people.
Yeah,
should we start with the naval officer, then come to you?
No, I think I'm okay. Yeah.
I'm Commander Agnihotri from the Navy. You talked about 3 reasons for having the carrier for Chinese particularly. One of the reasons you gave was carrier required for anti-piracy ops, HADR, evacuation ops during contingencies, etc. Being the people in the profession and having some experience in the Indian Navy of operating aircraft carriers, we feel that it is too much to invest in an aircraft carrier for these kind of jobs. Coincidentally, if they do these jobs in peacetime, it is fine. But then the carriers are meant to project power. So is it a viable enough reason for China to sink, I would say, billions, not only on this and the other 2 which are coming up in Shanghai and Dalian, for only doing these kind of things and for not taking up the, not taking the battle to the US? Of course, they have said that they'll not be able to take up the battle with the US. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I prefer to do one at a time, if you don't mind. Yeah. I have a short memory. Thank you for the question. I think it's absolutely right. If your sole purpose was for anti-piracy operations or for humanitarian operations, then this would be one of the least efficient ways to spend money to achieve that aim. So I don't in any way suggest that this would be the sole reason. Having said that, it is something that the United States, for instance, has done, and it's something that the Americans get a lot of positive publicity, soft power from when they send carrier fleets to disaster areas, such as after the Boxing Day tsunami, for instance, and when they were using the helicopter fleets on board the aircraft carriers to bring aid ashore and to actually bring people onto the ship for treatment. So it's just one reason, but it's not the only reason. We're going through this in Australia at the moment as well. We're buying two LHDs, and it seems almost inevitable to me that overwhelmingly these ships will be used for humanitarian operations. But if I had my way, we'd be finding much more effective ways to do that rather than, and I note there's an Australian naval officer sitting just behind you giving me dirty looks now, but that's an argument for another day. But yes, the short answer is yes, I agree with you.
Sir, during the early part of your lecture, you said China was pursuing a ship destruction strategy, and this seemed to be unprecedented or novel, but it seems to me quite conventional and standard. If you look at the strategy of Wilhelmine Germany or Nazi Germany, they stressed U-boats, largely for ship destruction. If you look at the strategy of the Soviet Union, they again put stress on submarines and missile boats. So, I mean, it seems quite typical of the weaker naval powers to pursue this sort of strategy. That's my comment on your remark that their program was sort of novel in the ship destruction idea.
Thank you. If I gave you that impression, I apologise. I didn't mean to suggest that a sea denial strategy, as the naval strategists call it, was in any way novel at all. I don't mean to suggest that, and I agree with you completely that that's not the case. The one novel element that I pointed to was the development of anti-ship ballistic missiles. That genuinely is a first. Nobody has done that before. And if the Chinese can make it work, such a capability would be extremely worrying for the US Navy in particular. It's interesting, though, that you point to the Soviet example, and I agree with you. The Soviets also pursued a sea denial strategy. Now, the aircraft carrier that the Chinese bought from the Ukrainians was a very unusual type of carrier. In fact, the Soviets at the time didn't call it an aircraft carrier. They called it, I forget the exact nomenclature, but I think they called it an aircraft carrying cruiser. Heavy aircraft carrying cruiser, thank you. And it carried a large battery of anti-ship missiles, which to me suggested that it was very consistent with other major fleet units in the Soviet Union and consistent with such a sea denial strategy and what was called also the bastion strategy that the Soviets developed to protect their nuclear deterrent. The interesting thing is when the Chinese eventually got hold of the hull and decided to refurbish it, they took out the anti-ship missiles. So the Chinese don't have, for this aircraft carrier, don't have a Soviet-style aircraft carrier in mind. They have in mind at least the beginnings of a much more American or traditional British style of aircraft carrier, which is not so much a sea denial asset as a sea control asset. And that really was the core of my point in my remarks, that the acquisition, the development of this aircraft carrier is not consistent with a sea denial strategy.
Right, so my second question is about nearer home, about their strategy towards India. In the event of another India-China war, would the Chinese have a dual strike strategy, one strike over the land border and another across the sea? Or is it going to be confined as earlier in '62, just a land strike?
I think if the war happened tomorrow, then the answer would be that it would be much like 1962, but because China...
Outcome? You mean in terms of outcome? Or
no. I should add that I think the chances of that are very low indeed.
KP Nair, I work for the Telegraph newspaper. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. But I recall reading several accounts a few years ago that after this businessman bought the ship from Ukraine, the Chinese consistently tried to mislead the world about their intentions. I particularly recall reading one account where they said that this ship would be used as a floating hotel with a strip club and cabaret and all that. No?
Yes.
While strategically this may not be important, since your narrative about putting the businessman to work in purchasing this is very interesting. To complete the picture, could you mention a few things about how the Chinese acted after it was bought and how they tried to mislead everyone about their intentions on this particular score?
Right. Well, I think the major cover story was that it was going to be a floating casino.
I think he means when they tried to cover up the shipyard, that kind of camouflage the construction itself.
Well, that's an interesting story. In fact, I don't think there was a great deal of camouflage of the actual ship once it arrived. In fact, this is a whole story in itself, the development in the internet era of the Chinese military enthusiasts inside China who make a hobby of taking photos of Chinese shipyards and posting them on the internet
For us to see.
for all of us to see. And this is the work that used to be undertaken at great expense. In the old Soviet days, for instance, work that used to be done at great expense and at great risk by, say, naval attachés or military attachés, who would surreptitiously need to visit shipyards and take photos, or you'd send satellites over Soviet shipyards to take photos. Now it's all done for free by Chinese military enthusiasts. And the fascinating thing about that is that they do it out of a sense of nationalism. They want to show off the country's military capabilities.
That's what I was referring to, about that 80%. It's
Right.
jingoism,
Yes, indeed. There's a lot of that around. Yeah.
Thank you. Two questions, if I may, sort of from my mind. You all referred to, in terms of decision making, but if you could elaborate a little more on the role of the PLA vis-a-vis the party, how much of a buy-in is there? It's very natural for the military strategists to plan something like this,
Yes.
denial and control and long-term strategy and so on. How much of a buy-in is there to all that long-term thing in the larger establishment in the party, considering the costs, and not just financial costs, but diplomatic costs? And so including on the assertivity, core interest definition on the Sea Islands and so on. They're probably torn between public opinion, which is with the military kind of thinking, and the military's own ambitions and aspirations, and realism on this side. And so thank you. And second one is about the silk, the One Belt, One Road, Maritime Silk project in particular. Would that at all have a bearing on any military long-term strategic aspects?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning. Could what have a bearing?
The One Belt, One Road, what they call, the land route and the maritime route, Silk route, they've given it this term, no? One
Right,
Belt,
yes,
One
yes.
Road.
Yeah.
So the maritime aspect of it particularly,
Yep.
would there be any potential, overtly, obviously there won't be any military aspect, but potentially would it be something that would have, could contribute towards military strategy in the long control? Thank you.
Well, on the first question, I'll begin by stressing that I'm moving, when I'm answering questions about the behaviour of the PLA Standing Committee and the Central Military Commission and so on, I'm moving outside my area of specialisation. But I think you get a pretty strong indication of the commitment at the highest levels to the carrier program by the fact that Xi Jinping made a very highly publicised visit to the ship just after it was commissioned. Was carried.
He has to reckon with the aspirations of the military.
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
Was not even aware of the fighter release when the US Defense Secretary.
Yes.
Things like that. You see how much of a buy-in is there really?
Yeah. Well, clearly the PLA Navy did make Xi Jinping aware of the carrier program. We can know that much. Yeah. But no, I think we can be pretty confident from the fact of Xi Jinping's visit that this is that in itself is a significant endorsement of.
Not just the carrier program that can't be stealthily done, but the larger design, the ambition. On that, is there a buy-in?
Yeah, that I can't. I honestly don't know. But my assumption is that there is at the very large, at the highest, most conceptual level, there is buy-in. But of course, we can't know that for certain. I'm sorry. Yeah. There was the second question just about the Silk Road strategy. I'll be quick on this point because again, I'm not terribly expert on it. But my understanding is that, well, first of all, of course, one of the possible purposes behind a carrier capability is that China eventually develops a maritime capability all the way, throughout the Asia Pacific and all the way to the Persian Gulf to protect its sea lines of communication and its oil supplies and so on. And it's been argued that China can avoid a lot of problems in this area by simply developing more capabilities to transport goods and to transport oil and gas over land through pipelines. But my understanding is that the technology simply doesn't exist to do that in enough volume to substitute for, the sea-based trade of those vessels. So China is and will remain dependent on those sea lines of communication for many years. So I think the Silk Road strategy is very much part of a larger strategic initiative to broaden China's influence in that region, but it can't substitute for having, for maintaining the security of its existing supply lines at sea. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm A.K. Merchant. I consider myself to be a concerned global citizen.
As are we all.
Yeah. Your focus has largely been the South China Sea, but what about the East China Sea and Japan now going full throttle with its defense programs? Because it was under a restraint of only devoting 1% of its GDP for self-defense.
Yes.
And then South Korea. So these two countries also need to be reckoned with as China develops. And then as a big second largest economy, of course, it has to do many things. And of course, the US has always been able to contain every country that has tried to project itself. But my question is relating to what would happen if Japan, with its high technological base, were to begin investing also considerable amounts in its defense preparedness, and also South Korea being aided by United States to also develop strategies and technologies that would easily counter Chinese advances. So on this score, what's your take, sir?
Thank you. I'd stress that, well, first of all, Japanese military spending does remain at 1% or below. It's still constitutionally mandated, but that's 1% of a lot. So, of course, the Japanese self-defense force is extremely capable already. There's an Australian angle to this, which it might interest you to hear. Back in 2009, Australia published a defence white paper which announced that Australia planned to double the size of its submarine fleet from 6 to 12, which is a fairly dramatic gesture and was read at the time as being directly in response to the rise of Chinese military capabilities. That was, of course, denied by the government, but that was the self-evident subtext. Australia has, since that time, never really figured out how it was going to pay for a doubling of the size of its submarine fleet, but nevertheless, that's still on the books, and it's still an ambition that the government has. In more recent times, our new Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, has developed a very close personal relationship with Shinzo Abe. They seem to get along fairly well. There's good personal chemistry between the two of them. There's now a new free trade agreement between Australia and Japan. There is an annual strategic dialogue between defence ministers and our defence and foreign ministers. And what we may see, probably in the first quarter of next year, is that the Australian government, after a short contest or a short tender process, will announce that Australia is going to buy Japanese submarines to fulfil this contract for 12 submarines. That's not a certainty. We could yet buy German or French boats, but I think the Japanese design is the front runner. And that would be quite not only important for Australia's defence capabilities, but would be a really important strategic gesture, a symbol for Japan. Japan has never done this before. It's never exported submarines. And in fact, it's never exported weapon systems. But of course, we know that Shinzo Abe is trying to redefine, or has redefined, the Japanese constitution. And a sale like this would be a very important symbol of how China plans to emerge as a more, what it would call a more normal security player in the Asia-Pacific. And it would be doing so in a way that I think is dramatic in a sense, because it's a very dramatic gesture to suddenly sell 12 submarines to a foreign country, but is also trying to signal a level of reassurance, because the customer is Australia, which is a democracy, which is seen as fairly safe and fairly benign in an international context. So that relationship, I think, has an important symbolic and strategic element vis-a-vis Japan's attitude to China.
We've almost run out of time.
Because I talk too much, I'm sorry.
Questions and two quick brief questions, and one from you.
Thank you, Mr. Ogden. I am Admiral Arup Singh, retired. First of all, I'd like to make a small, short comment on the business of the story of this businessman. There's been a lot beyond the South China Morning Post, even in the Western press. I think this is battery seems to have run out.
Ah, there we are. Yeah.
Now it's working because it's made in China, actually. Okay, now, you know, there's a Montreal Convention that you must have heard about in the Bosphorus
Yes.
Strait, 1936. That's why these people called it cruiser instead of a carrier.
Yes, yes, yes.
And there was an agreement between the people, the business house which was buying, that it will not be used for offense. And that's why the Chinese are saying it's for training purposes. They've said it officially at the highest level.
Yes.
But you have said that, you know, from A to AD, it doesn't really make sense going into an aircraft carrier. I think money makes the mare go. They've got so much of it, and they've got so peeved by the third Taiwan Strait incident and the great show in the Operation Desert Storm that they've gone in for power projection now. That's why the Type 55.
Yes.
Secondly, don't you think that the Gulf of Aden anti-piracy mission was a godsend opportunity to these guys to open up to the world and test their sea legs? That's why they are now becoming overambitious and are wanting to actually show to America that they can be some kind of a match in the Western Pacific. That's why they are making their forays even into the Indian Ocean.
Sure, yeah.
Quick, very short.
My question is, how would Japan, how do you feel Japan would respond if, as in when it lost Taiwan, because the first island chain, of which Taiwan is the pivot, is its strategic depth?
Whew. How would Japan react if Taiwan was lost to China? Oh.
Quick three-word.
Sam, I'm a journalist. My name is Ajay Banerjee. I have little clarifications. You did not mention about the Chinese nuclear-powered and nuclear attack submarine fleet that is growing at a very fast pace. And do you reckon that anti-ship missile of China could be launched from undersea or from land? And do you reckon that India could be dragged into the South China Sea in any way?
You need me? Okay. Bullet answers. Okay. I think it's too early to talk about, on the specific point, I think it's too early to talk about China trying to match the United States in the Indian Ocean. Much too early. Whenever we talk about Chinese military capability growth, we must always keep in mind that China's overwhelming first priority is internal development. You know, military modernization has grown in leaps and bounds, obviously, but it's still a secondary consideration. Its first consideration is internal development. All aspects of foreign policy and strategic policy very much take second place to that. When security and foreign policy does take its place, it is generally focused on its borders, its land borders, and then on the Asia Pacific. So the Indian Ocean, I think, that's a much later concern. I know I haven't addressed all aspects of your question. I apologise. Taiwan. Gosh, I'm not sure what to say about that, except I think the chances of it ever happening now are extremely low, of China ever taking military action against Taiwan, because it seems to me that so much of what's happening in that relationship is in China's favour already, that it would be very much, counterproductive for China to take any kind of military action. China, I'm glad somebody mentioned Chinese nuclear submarines. I actually disagree. I'm interested in, because this sea denial strategy has been so popular as a way of explaining China's military and naval modernisation, it's extraordinary to me that the submarine element of it has been relatively slow compared to the surface fleet. I think modernisation of the surface fleet has actually gone faster than the submarines. Now that may be simply because we know less about submarine modernisation in the open source. It's easier to hide submarine development, submarine capabilities than it is surface ships. So we may know less, but I think overall Chinese submarine capability.
Perspective on how you look at development of the Chinese maritime capability and modernization, a very useful insight. It doesn't work. So, but thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed being with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. I've very much enjoyed it, and can I thank you all for coming? Can I wish you luck in the World Cup, but not too much luck?